Vamos passar agora à última sessão, que é com o professor Karlan. Por favor. O professor Karlan é professor de Economia na Universidade de Yale, é presidente da Innovation for Poverty Action, que é uma organização sem fins lucrativos dedicada à descoberta e promoção de soluções eficazes para os problemas globais da pobreza. O professor integra o Comitê Executivo do Conselho de Administração do MIT Poverty Action Lab, que é um centro de investigação do MIT e que foi precursor também com Innovation for Poverty Action no uso de Randomized Trial, destas experiências em que se consegue estabelecer causalidade de intervenções de desenvolvimento. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming.
So obviously, I'm going to present it in English. My apologies, I can do Spanish, but not Portuguese. So when I used to work in Brazil, I used to always, I could not understand Portuguese, but they could understand my Spanish. So I would present in Spanish, and then we had like this little circle translation going between Portuguese to Spanish back to English. So I promise you now, for better or worse, so I think you might like this or you might not like this. I have no tables whatsoever in this presentation. Just broad stroke ideas, talking about a collection of studies and how they fit together. And so there will be some results that I'll talk about, but there are no actual tables with numbers and stars and things of this nature. The title of the talk is one of the key messages I want to leave you with, and I think a lot of the presentations we've heard today, this is a consistent theme. The financial inclusion is a means to an end. It's not an end. One of the things that I'm often struck by when I get involved in conversations about financial inclusion at the kind of the policy level is how often we are bombarded with statistics about how many people are banked and how many people have access to credit or have a loan, or how many people have mobile money and things of this nature. But the most common one that we see is just the simple one of like, what proportion of people in rural Mozambique have a bank account? What proportion of people in urban Mozambique have a bank account? Things of this nature. And the fact is, this is just, in some sense, to be perfectly crass, I've never been quite sure whether I care about that number. It tells me a little bit, but it doesn't tell me anything about the quality of what of the financial service that they have access to. So they might have a bank account, but it doesn't actually satisfy their needs in any way. And so this is part of what I mean by finance is a means to an end. We have to think about why is it that people need financial services, and then ask ourselves whether the financial services they're getting are satisfying those needs. And just merely kind of checking a box and ticking and saying, aha, they have access to a bank account, might really miss the heart of what it's about. So the short answer is finance is not for finance sake, right? No. What is finance? What is finance effectively? Well, in a very broad kind of almost theoretical sense, it's the reason we need financial services is because income and consumption do not match. That's a very broad way of saying it, right? That you earn money maybe once a year, maybe once a month, but you spend money all the time, every day. You also spend money a lot at certain times of the year. And maybe you even want to spend money now that actually is using future income to pay for that, right? As an investment. Right, so there's lots of times when you just have a mismatch between your income and consumption. That's all. And that's basically what financial services is all about. Some of that is also, everything I just described is about merely timing. Obviously, some of it can be about risk as well, right? When there's mismatches, that mismatch might be kind of correct on average, or even the timing is right, but the amounts are wrong because of risk, right? So, examples of this include seasonal variation, income shocks, consumption shocks. So an income shock as in, there's a drought or a flood. And a financial service could help solve that issue by selling insurance, for instance, or access to credit can also be used in that context. A consumption shock What I mean by consumption shock, they can be both good and bad consumption shocks. So a bad consumption shock is my kid gets sick and I need to pay for medical bills. Where's that money coming from? A good consumption shock is my kid is going to college, or my kid got married, or something like this, right? Think of that, or I'm having a child. Think of those as good consumption shocks. Durable goods, right? So here's a situation where you just need a lumpy amount of money, whether you borrowed to pay for that or saved up, it's just a question of timing, right? Either way, you're making lots of little payments in order to make a durable good purchase. If you borrow, then you get the durable good, and then you pay it off. If you save up for it, well then you make little payments along the way, and then get it. There's a great book that I remember reading many years ago, 15, 20 years ago when I was in graduate school, called The Poor and Their Money by Stuart Rutherford. And it really goes into a lot of detail about a lot of informal savings vehicles, but it really makes the very clear point that the difference between savings and debt is actually not as big as we make it out to be. It's just a matter of which one comes first. And the poor need lots of ways to make little deposits and large withdrawals, and the order in which those two happen is just, that determines whether we call it savings or debt. But the fact that we do see people using one versus the other can tell us a lot about human behavior, and that's part of how we can think through products that can help people can fulfill the things they need in life better. So why is it hard? Why do people borrow for expensive items that are fully predictable? One of the puzzles I remember being struck with a long time ago was how frequent it was, in this puzzle, I'm sure it exists around the world, but in the context that I was facing it was in India, and how frequent it was that people would take out loans to pay for school fees. And we were really struck by this because, if you think about it, school fees, there's no shock there. You know exactly when that's going to come due. And I don't know when it was, let's say it's September, you have to pay your school fees. And so every year, people would take out a loan for school fees and then pay it down over 4 to 6 months. And they would do this every year. And the question is, why are you paying this in October, November, December, January, right after your school fees, when if you saved up, and I'm just going to be simplistic about it, you might only have to save up for 3 months, but you have to pay down over 4. It costs you a lot more money because of the interest. So why didn't you instead start saving June, July, August, and then boom, September comes along and you have your school fees you need? And one reality is there's a lot of constraints on us that make it harder for us to save. There's a lot of claims from family, self-control issues. Your own attention needs to be primed and focused on that savings good. Whereas with a loan, you can totally be not paying any attention whatsoever. You don't need any discipline, right? In fact, the lack of discipline might actually lead you to borrow. All of a sudden, school fees come due, and that bank is right there, and as long as you have good credit, they're happy to lend to you. And you also don't have to pay too much attention to repay the loan, because the bank will help you bring your attention to that loan. They will remind you. So you don't have to pay that much attention. So there's a lot about the process that's set up that kind of leads us to borrowing instead of saving. And that's one of the things that can be very exciting when we think about financial inclusion and all of these different integrations between mobile money and banking is basically thinking through what are those individual failures, so to speak, about the way we engage and make choices about borrowing versus savings, and how can we create savings products that can help people achieve those goals. Let's take the savings example, how can we create a savings product so that when school fees come due, people have the money for school fees and they don't have to take out a loan for it? Because in aggregate, they're still paying the school fees. So if you look at like a 10-year history of their life, it's really striking that the school fees get paid either way, but in one model with savings, they get a lot more money to do other things they want in life. And in the model in which they have to borrow a ton, they spend a lot of money to the banks in order to have their school fees. Okay. Why is it hard to know what to do? There's two issues that I think are rampant in a lot of studies on financial inclusion. One of them is about knowing what to measure. Think about money as like pouring water on a table. and needing to know in advance exactly where it's going to go, because you got to measure it. You want to know when you give someone access to a savings account, how does that change their life? Well, we could go on forever right now, brainstorming on all the ways people can use savings accounts. They could use it for school fees, health, education. They could just let it accumulate. They could flitter it away on temptation goods that are lumpy. There's a million directions it can go. We have no idea. Right? And so when you want to think about what's the impact of giving someone access to something basic like a savings account or even a loan, you have to look everywhere all at once. And what that also implies from just a kind of a wonky statistical point is if the answer isn't dominated by any one thing in the population, and instead you do one thing, you do another, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then when we aggregate that up and we look at what's happening, we're going to still have a hard time finding it because it's a little of everything. It means we need massive studies with huge sample sizes or some other way of aggregating. And that's one reason why I think we do find, when we compare across studies, we do find some consistencies, but we also find a lot of differences, and we surprisingly find a lot of what we would call noisiness, and just hard to know what's really happening. And that's not because nothing's happening, it's that it's a lot of little things happening. The second issue that makes a lot of these studies hard to do, and I think a lot of why we're seeing this a lot of focus on this work, because there's a big gap, is about differentiating between causation and correlation. Now, I missed the first talk, but I believe every talk you've heard today has been a randomized trial. Is that correct? Okay. So what's that? Not the first. Okay. Well, I'm hearing different answers to that. We'll let that debate lie. So that's a big change in this space. When I was in graduate school, that would not have been the case, that we get into a gathering like this and seen that many randomized trials. And then the reason for this is because of years and years of frustration with trying to understand and separate out causation from correlation. There's one particular setting in which this is really rampant, and I think gives a good motivation, and that has to do with financial literacy, and another on microcredit, which I'll tell you in a moment. Financial literacy is one of these classic cases where correlation does not necessarily imply causation. What you can do, there's been studies in the United States, for instance. It's very easy to show that people who have higher levels of financial literacy are more successful in life in many, many ways. They're more likely to have finished college, they have higher income, higher savings, the list goes on. There's a very strong correlation between higher financial literacy and various outcomes of success. That does not mean, of course, that financial literacy caused that to happen. Right? In fact, it could be the exact opposite way around. You made more money, having more money forced you to think about your money a little bit more and how to invest it, and with that came a lot of knowledge about interest rates and bonds and stocks and all these various things. And so the causation goes exactly the opposite way. It also could just be that even if you're dealing with people that are within a certain socioeconomic strata, that it's not like wealthy stock market, that the type of person who is earnest about learning financial issues about finance and how to manage one's money are also earnest about how to manage their money. Right? And it has nothing to do with the tools of financial literacy that make them earnest, or tools of financial literacy that made them more successful, but they're just an earnest person who went around and sought out both of these things. Again, what that suggests is a strong correlation, but not causation. That does not mean if you go and take a set of people and teach them basics financial literacy, that this will actually change behavior. And one of the striking things that we have seen, again, there's exceptions to what I'm about to say, but for the most part, programs which promote financial literacy and do nothing more, as in they don't work. It doesn't change anything. It leads to a little bit more knowledge. It can answer, it's like I can give you an exam at the end of this lecture with a few basic questions. Is finance the end goal or the means to the end? And you might, hopefully you'll say no, it's a means to the end. But that doesn't mean it's going to change your behavior. It's the same thing with financial literacy. We see a lot of changes It's like giving someone an exam at an end. They listened, they got it, they marked the things, but then you go back a year later, is behavior really different? Are they saving more? Things like that, and you don't see much of any. Right? There are ideas that integrating financial literacy that are very practical tools along with products might have a lot of success. So I know I heard just in the last discussion a lot of conversations about the need for teaching people about mobile money, and I'm not contradicting that. I think there's a lot to be said about just learning the mechanics of how to use the mobile money and how does it work, and that's what I mean by financial literacy, very integrated in and tight to a product. So this type of this conflict actually between correlation and causation is at the heart of why all of these studies that you're seeing are randomized trials. It's just to get around this problem. Because if all we did is look and see, hey, there's a strong correlation between financial literacy and behavior, we would go off to the races and waste probably a lot of money on big government-run financial literacy programs. Okay, so what is financial inclusion? So usually when I hear the term financial inclusion, I'm typically hearing about one of three things. And I added this fourth, financial education, only because I do think it deserves some discussion as it's incorporated into the other three, but I put a question mark in it for the reasons I just said. One thing that's very striking is how often microfinance and microcredit are treated synonymously, but everybody in the finance space hopefully knows better and knows that the term finance includes things beyond loans, it includes savings, it includes insurance. What I don't have in here is payments, and that might be a mistake. I should probably add that to the slide. So let me talk about, I'm going to talk through each of these now, microcredit, microsavings, microinsurance, and some of the basics of what we know. And I'm going to start off with credit, partly because I want to take the historical path here, in terms of the way the financial inclusion space has grown over the past 30 years. And it very much started as credit, for the reason that, as I said just a moment ago, a lot of people even rhetorically confuse the two. I've done it myself. I'll find myself giving a talk and I mean microcredit and I say microfinance. So what is the kind of the classic theory of change for microcredit? The classic theory of change had to do with entrepreneurs, micro-entrepreneurs, who are in need of credit, who are hardworking entrepreneurial individuals, hence that creates a selection bias, which is why we need to conduct randomized trials in order to understand the impact of giving people access to loans. But they're supposed to take these loans, invest it in their enterprise. With that enterprise bigger, it now makes more money. With that extra money, they spend more money on things like household consumption, health and education of their children, things like that, and then on downstream from there, all the way to things like physiological health, psychological life satisfaction, social empowerment. Female empowerment was also a big theme in many of the programs that were trying to expand or succeeding in expanding access to credit for the poor. So we now have 7 randomized trials of microcredit that I at last count. I'm sure I'm missing something that's even more recent, but I'm aware of 7. And one, which I didn't put on here, of consumer credit that I will mention, because I think it's very interesting in terms of how it compares to these. 6 of these were just published January of 2015 in American Economic Journal. That's the first 6 on here. And the 7th here was published 4 years ago in Science from the Philippines. The striking thing here is how not much is happening, right? You have a few things here. We can go through the steps along the way of that theory of change. You do have some business ownership going up. A lot of the talk of microcredit has to do with starting enterprises. We see two sites where we saw some impact on business ownership. Same thing with business revenue. We only see 2 sites with some impact on that out of the 7. We do see business inventory of assets going up a bit more, fairly consistently. 2 sites didn't have data on it, but we do see 4 sites of the 5 with some evidence of increased businesses. But those increased businesses are not leading to increased profits. Look at business profit, flat, 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 flat. Negative, a dash just means flat, no result. Only 1 site had an increase in actual profits. And that's a striking striking non-result there for the canonical story. Now, why might that be? Well, two things are going on. One is, let's not forget, these actually in many cases aren't that cheap, these loans. Right? So what's the return on investment that you have to make? When I first got started in this space was 1992, living in El Salvador, working for a microcredit organization. This is before the days of the internet. And when I signed on to be an intern for this group, I was very excited about the idea, the promise, the theory. Nowhere on this brochure did it mention the interest rate. When I got to El Salvador and discovered that the interest rate was 72% per annum, I kind of was a little bit of shock. And personally, I was on my way to business school. This is before I had dreams of doing what I do now. And I remember thinking to myself, if I could clear 72% a year return on investment, like, I'd be really rich. Like, what's going on here that's what these businesses are clearing? In order for this to call itself poverty alleviation, right, they have to be making more money from the loan than they're spending on the loan. Now, that sounds really negative, and I'm not actually that negative. There's a couple things going on. One is, in many cases, at the really tiny scale, they actually do have that high marginal returns. Right? It's just that it doesn't scale from there. There's a limit, right? There's many, when I remember, it wasn't my job, but I did sit down with some clients and I tried to understand what were they doing differently with access to a loan. And I remember a couple, this was not rigorous research by any means, but I remember a couple telling me stories of like, well, I used to have to go into the city twice a week to buy my supplies, and this allowed me to go in and buy a month of supplies all at once, and that gives me 5 extra days of work. So there's like a very simple story where it actually paid off in return. Having said that, it's not surprising that you don't see this, big impact on profits when you do have, when people actually have to pay back the loans. The other issue is that not everybody's using the money for the business. A lot of people are using it just as a loan because they want to buy a durable good for the household. So when we look at household income, we see no change. When we see household spending, so in a sense, this is, when we want to talk about poverty alleviation, if that's what the goal of microcredit is, and that's the goal that was sold for many years, then we want to look at household consumption. We want to know, okay, at the end of the day, are they consuming more? And here's where we actually see 2 negatives and 1 positive. Why would it be negative? Well, they have to pay back the loan. That's not a bad thing, just to be clear. Right? That means they bought a TV, and now they have to repay it. Well, repaying, and then when the measurement happens a year later, they're repaying the loan, and so you end up seeing this kind of negative. The striking thing here, more than anything, and there's some other measures not summarized in here that had to do with risk, that people were using credit as a way of absorbing risk. And so that's a good thing, we like that, from a social policy perspective. It does kind of make you scratch your head and say, well, if you're using this to mitigate a risk, then what's wrong with the insurance markets? Right? Something must be wrong over there. So is there something we can think about on the insurance markets to improve them? Because if there is, that's probably first best rather than having people take out loans to absorb shocks. The one that's not on here is South Africa. So South Africa, for those of you who know the market in South Africa, this comes from the kind of the cash loan market, which was regulated by the Microfinance Regulatory Council. So they kind of called themselves microcredit, but to a lot of people in the international microcredit kind of space, they saw this as very different because it was lending to salaried individuals. It was not the 1 month. There's a market there that's for 1 month at like 30% per month, or at least that's what it was 10 years ago when I was doing this work there. This was a slightly more upscale market and downscale in terms of interest rates. So they would make 4-month loans at about 12% per month calculated on the original balance, so a little bit more modest, but still fairly high. But the loans were made to salaried individuals, not to entrepreneurs, not to micro-entrepreneurs. If you walk in, you show pay stub, you get access to this microcredit loan. This was the only one of these 8 studies that showed an increase in household income, which is ironic because it was the one that was kind of the most hated from the microcredit space in terms of what this lender was doing in their model of lending. But again, it was the only one that found an increase in household income. Why? Well, it was fairly simple. Not for everybody, but for enough of the people were taking out a loan that something was going on in their life, some sort of shock or some sort of need, and if they didn't get access to some cash, they were going to lose their job. So there was a few different stories that were consistent with this that had to do with either transportation, needing it for transportation, needing it for like uniforms and things of this, or there was something going on with a family back home, and so it was a choice, send money or go home yourself, or something of this nature. There's a few stories like that got told to us qualitatively that kind of fit with the aggregate data. Bottom line is, get access to a loan, people were more likely to still be employed a year later. And the difference between having a job and not having a job is actually quite noticeable when you start aggregating up household income. So it was the only one of the studies that actually found a positive impact on household income. Needless to say, that's not a message we took to the microcredit world, was that what you should do is go away from entrepreneurs to salaried individuals and jack up your interest rates to 200% APR, and then you can have a positive impact on household income. Yet ironically, that is the comparison. So one of the messages though from all of this, two of the messages, let's put them together. One, it goes back to my first point, money is slippery, it goes in many ways. There isn't going to be one simple model for how people use a loan. If we do want people to use a loan in a particular way, we might want to think about how we're setting up that loan and how we're structuring it. But people can ultimately take the terms of a loan and then do what they want. So here we go. So there's one other point I want to make of these 7 studies. In the last 5 years, we've actually seen a bit of debate in the microcredit space with people arguing microcredit is bad. And one of the striking things is we do not see in any of these studies any systematic evidence of bad outcomes. It's not to say that every single person succeeded with it, I want to be clear, right? But I'm just making a kind of an on average statement. There's none of the sites identified any real strong ill effects. So that's a very positive thing. And at the end of the day, what we're struck with the microcredit space is that the investment model, the for-profit model, is actually doing fine, but it's not alleviating poverty. So to the extent that that's how we get into the financial inclusion space, is by asking ourselves, how can we help financial inclusion advance our goals of poverty alleviation? Microcredit, as it's currently being done, is not doing that. So let it flourish, let the investors do it, let the banks do it, and be happy about it because it's causing good things to happen. But it's not going to achieve that poverty alleviation goal. So what do we do? Two guiding principles on what we should do. And then I'm going to go through some examples, starting with credit and then moving on to savings and insurance. The first is that evidence trumps hope and intuition. That it's fairly easy for a lot of things to just that, have hope and intuition. Microcredit had it for many years, and the evidence came out and suggested not actually meeting what the hope and intuition that many had was. The second main principle is to design for humans. Design for how people actually behave, not how we think they should behave, not how we dreamed up our product should get used, but how people actually behave. And that means taking into account a whole mix and bag of issues that people may have that are different. Not everybody has them. Right? Maybe people are really tempted by free cash in their pocket. Designing a product around that can be helpful. Maybe people have huge claims that come in from their neighbors and cousins and brothers. Designing products around that can be helpful. Maybe people just don't pay too much attention to anything that's further than a month from now. And so designing a product around that can be very helpful. So understand what's really, how people are actually managing their money, and then designing products around that. So let me give you an example of designing for humans, or differentiating between what people should do and what people do, and why it's so important to know that difference. So this is a fairly old study for those of you who are from the academics. So we did this is actually with the same lender in South Africa that I referred to earlier. And we in an earlier study with them, we tested out people's sensitivity to interest rates. The study started actually just that. It started as a study where we wanted to understand sensitivity to interest rates and understanding both as the lender changed their interest rate, what happened to the quantity of loans they would make and to the demand. We also wanted to know what would happen to the riskiness of the loans as the interest rate changed. But when we started off this project, we realized that the bank had done direct marketing before, but they didn't really have any evidence on what types of letters worked to bring people in and what did not. And so we started brainstorming on our own about what would work, what would a good marketing letter look like. And before we knew it, we had more questions than answered, and we realized that we had an entirely different study here that we were excited about, was to work with this bank to figure out and get evidence on what actually works for their marketing. So I first want to back up for a second and imagine, our goal here was to help this bank bring people in, because that was part of what we needed to do our study in a totally selfish way, was lots of people to come in and take out loans. Okay, we also were just working with the bank, so we're helping them. Right? And imagine for a moment that we held a focus group or two to ask people what really matters to you for a loan, so that we could then work with them to design the best product. So get some ideas in your head. What do you? And I'm going to just rattle off some things. I'm going to guess these are the types of things you're guessing. The price of the loan. How much can you borrow? How trusted is the bank? How long do you have to repay the loan? Okay. So these were things that we randomized on this letter. We randomized everything I just told you. So basically everything between these two letters is a separate little randomized test. So we can see, as we change this one little thing on the letter, what happens to demand. So the interest rate, which is implicit in the tables, and some of the letters actually say the interest rate too, was tested. Here they get one choice for a loan, here they got 12, right? So, if you only offer someone one thing and they don't want it, then they walk away. But if you offer them 12, well, maybe they'll like one of the 12, and so they're more likely to borrow. That's what an economist would say. A psychologist would say, no, it goes the other way. If you give someone 12 choices, then they look at it and they're stumped. And they're like, well, I'll think about that later. And they don't do anything. Whereas if you give them one choice, it's a much simpler decision, and they're actually more likely to borrow. What's that? I'm sorry? Right. And so, but the idea is the economists would say you're more likely to get the no because they don't see the option they want. It does say in fine print here, loans available in other terms. So the loan, the length of repayment is randomized. Whether they're told it's a trusted way to borrow cash, that's the slogan. That's kind of the slogan for the bank. We have a pretty woman over here, but no pretty woman over here. And we have, well, let's just go with that. So let's do a show of hands. I'm going to have two audience participation components here. This is one. I'm going to give you four things, and I want to ask you, which one do you think mattered most? We have the price. We have whether there was more choices or fewer choices. We have whether they had a trusted way to borrow, 3. And we have the pretty woman. Raise your hand if you think price was the big driver of demand. Nobody? Okay. Raise your hand if you think having more choices was critical for demand. Raise your hand if you think trust was really critical. Raise your hand if you think the pretty woman was the driver. Raise your hand if you didn't. Raise your hand if you didn't vote. No one's voting. Okay. I'm going to make you vote on the next one. The answer is the woman. Having the woman on that marketing piece of paper made men just as likely to borrow as if we had dropped their interest rate by 60 percentage points. Okay. Now, you're not going to get that out of a focus group, or at least no focus group I've ever been to. Right? No one is ever going to actually say, well, yeah, I care about price, that's important, but can you just get me a photo of a pretty woman, please, on the marketing material, then I'll come borrow from you. Like, no one's ever going to self-reflect on that one. It's just, women liked it too, but they just wasn't as strong. So for women, they were just as likely to borrow with the photo of the woman as they were if the interest rate was dropped by 30 percentage points. And the answer on the other choice one, by the way, was that less choice was good. That had more demand, that had fewer choices than more choices. So the point here is design for humans. Does that mean up here, I really hope, particularly all you people in the mobile space, that your takeaway from this is, okay, we got to get more photos of women on our marketing material. I really hope that's not my value added in this space. But my value added hope is that we need to understand marketing is important. We need to understand the drivers of the types of choices, and embrace that. Let it work for you, but let's still remember that it makes the product a good product. That's it. Okay. So on to products. So I told you the traditional microcredit wasn't quite living up to its promise, but what about modifications of the model? So I'm going to go back to one of the other kind of things that I remember thinking when I first started in this space was I just finished 2 years of investment banking, and in that investment banking job, one of the things that we did a lot of was matching cash flows. If there's a company looking to build a factory, the first thing we would do is get inside the box and try to understand when that factory was going to start generating revenue, and then structure a bond that had them paying back when the revenue was going to come in. You match, right? The company doesn't want to take a finance risk. They want to finance their investment. And then they want to take the revenues from that investment and pay back the loan. But then we went to these microcredit programs, and the story I was told is, yes, we're going to make a loan to this woman and she's going to get a sewing machine. And with that sewing machine, then she can start being more productive at producing things and then sell in big bulk. And I was like, so how, or another story was actually in farming, in more rural areas. Yes, they can take out this microcredit loan, and with that, they can finally buy the fertilizer that they haven't been buying, that everybody told them they should buy. They're like, when's that going to pay off? They're like, at harvest season, 4 months later. And when does she have to start repaying her loan? 1 week after she gets the loan. Oh, where's the money coming from? Obviously somewhere else. I mean, they are getting their money back. But it really told me to strike, why is there a disconnect here? Why aren't we matching cash flows? So there's been a recent start of projects that are trying to do this. So one is Field et al. Had a delayed start of their first repayment, exactly kind of this issue that I'm just describing, where they just said they gave the people 2 months before they had to start repaying, so that they could let their investment flourish a little bit and start generating some money, and then start repaying the loan. New business starts were much higher. Similar logic, right? Any kind of startup, even if it's at a micro level, has to have some runway. Giving someone that runway made them more likely to take out the loan. After 3 years, so this is a fairly good long-term result. Income is up 20% and capital is 80% higher in the treatment compared to control. That's a striking result. Reducing frequency of repayments. Again, this is looking at the cash flows of the business and realizing that if they're constantly having to repay, they're constantly having to pay attention to gathering the money, and it might actually be better for them to have that payment less frequent. And it turned out that making it monthly led to less stress for the clients and was cheaper for the lender. It also was weaker for creating social capital, so there was a little bit of a trade-off there in terms of what was going on. One that I'm working on right now in Colombia involves giving people passes. So the idea is perhaps people are over-borrowing and putting some money aside, which is a behavior we often hear about, so that if they have a really bad week, they have the money to pay. Well, that's a really costly setup. They're now borrowing more than they have to. And so why not just give them a couple free passes? So that if their child is sick and they needed money that week for the medical bills, or they were sick and so they couldn't work, they have a couple passes and then they can get off that week, right? And you get the same amount of money back. You make it so that they have 16 weeks, if there's a 14-week loan, they have 16 weeks to repay in 2 passes instead of just demanding all the money in 14 weeks. So we're middle of testing that one. I don't have results. But I think that's an area that is really promising. To the extent that we're thinking about microcredit and we want to stay within the lending model, we have to ask ourselves, well, how can we make the lending model fit better to the actual needs that people have? Segueing for just 1 second, I don't have this on the slide, but I want to leave you guys with one thought, is the integration of credit with mobile money is one of the most exciting and scary things I'm aware of in this space. The idea that, one of the things that keeps microcredit interest rates high is that it's expensive to do. And the transaction costs, the labor costs are high. To the extent that, and we're starting to see a few different companies out there using the mobile top-up data and mobile money transfer data as a credit scoring model, right? So it now needs no human interaction at all. So what this implies is, with enough data, a few clicks on your cell phone, boom, you have a loan. That is exciting and scary, right? It's exciting because it means the cost should be way down for making that loan, and just with a smidgen of competition, we should be able to really expand people's access to credit at affordable prices. Why is it scary? Well, it's not going to be free, right? And the idea that someone can get access to cash with 3 clicks on a cell phone might actually lead to some overborrowing and people not fully being aware of what they're getting into because it's just so easy to do. So how do we engage in consumer protection in that space so that we can let that space flourish, but also make sure that people are taking out loans that they fully understand? And that's a really important area, so that, you know, hoping that we can see in the near future some promising collaborations between the mobile operators, the ministries of finance who deal with regulation, and researchers to kind of help figure out what that right model is so that we can make it really easy for people to get low-cost loans, but low-cost loans that they actually understand and are on board with. Do I like the little... I don't see any clock. Okay. So there's a lot of complementary programs to credit that we've seen flourish as well that look, and this goes back to the financial literacy programs and also entrepreneurship trainings programs. In general, these kind of tend to be fairly weak, as I mentioned. There are a few that do have some success. One of the bigger ones is a study Drexler et al. From the Dominican Republic, and what this found is that the more narrow one was, you don't talk about big principles. Don't open up with talking about finance as a means to an end. That would be like the worst thing you could possibly do. Instead, give people simple rules of thumb. Separate your business money from your household money. Keep these in separate bags. Things like that. Pay yourself from your business. Don't ever just take money out of the business and go and consume things. Very simple rules like that were helpful. But anytime things, when they tested out also just kind of broader teaching people principles, that just totally failed. Okay. So going back now, thinking through the theory of change to microcredit and microfinance in general, we see, so I told you one deviation here is to think about how can we alter the credit model. Another way now to think about this, given our lack of huge success from the core, is to say, well, what else is there? What about savings and what about insurance? How promising can those be? So I want to talk about savings, and then insurance. So, 2 basic themes in savings and things that we've seen, and things that cause there to be a market failure. A couple things we've heard about. One is distance to banks, where mobile money is hopefully just completely making that irrelevant. Obviously, there's still distance to agents and things like this, but we're seeing huge inroads here. And that's huge and that's promising, but that probably doesn't solve the problem because we still have some behavioral issues that we are keenly aware of and there's tremendous evidence for. I'm going to talk about 2: temptation spending and inattention. So temptation spending is accumulating up a bit of money and then spending it on something else and never actually saving up enough for that larger thing that you really need. Right? Inattention has to do with need, and this could be inattention on many dimensions. It could be inattention to tasks. I meant to go make the deposit and I forgot to. I got busy and it slipped my mind. Inattention also could be, I know my income, but I don't know all my future expenses, and I always underestimate them. And that's true of a lot of things. There's this kind of nebulous other category in life that we always underestimate. So one of my favorite little psychology experiments would have been the following. Suppose that I didn't show up today, and you were given a little piece of paper. It wasn't so crazy. Thanks to everyone who organized, got my visa in the nick of time. And you were given a little piece of paper, and I gave half of you a piece of paper that said, "Why didn't Dean show up?" And you were given 2 options in another category. One option is he didn't get his visa. Second option was the flight is late, and then other. And let's say you guys put down some numbers for the first 2 and 30% for other. as the likelihood that that was the cause. And you guys over here, the other half, I gave you the same first two reasons, but then the third reason was I was sick. And then a fourth, other. In theory, your sick plus other category should add up to 30%. Sick was in their other, right? I just broke it out for you guys. But it won't be. You'll probably still have 30% for other, and then 10% for sick. I don't know the exact numbers, obviously. I'm just saying, those two together are going to add up to more. So we often underestimate that other category of life, and the minute we're given very specific things that fit into it, that category grows, and we realize it's more and more likely. So the same thing, how much are you saving right now? Right? What are you saving for? And you have a bunch of stuff, you don't know exactly. Maybe one thing stands out, but then a bunch of other stuff fits into that other category. The minute we piece it out and we say, are you saving for school fees? Are you saving for fertilizer? Are you saving for health? Are you saving for a vacation? Are you saving for this? Are you saving for that? Then it adds up. You're like, ooh, I'm not saving enough. I ought to add more. Okay? And that's one of the models we need of inattention. All these things are not in your mind, you end up undersaving. Okay. So let me tell you about some studies that are building off of these things. The first one, this is the second audience participation one. Hopefully we can do better than last. Ready? So I'm going to tell you about the setup of a study. One of the striking things, and one of the reasons we do the work we do, is because it's often easy to rationalize a result. Give a result, and then you can say, yeah, that makes sense, but blah, 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 blah. It's often much harder to predict up front what's the result going to be. And there's many things that might fit into a basic theory, but we still, we still don't know. So here's the setup, and I'll give you the choice at the end. So the basic problem, this was working in Uganda. Students and family reported not enough money to pay for school fees. School supplies and tests. There's no actual school fees in Uganda. It's universal primary education, but you still have to pay for this, and you pay for that, and you pay for those things. So we did this in grades 5, 6, and 7, and the students were the representative from this NGO we were working with brought in a little box where the kids put deposits in the box. The money from the box went off and was deposited into a bank. They did that every week. And at the beginning of a term, then a fair was held in which school supplies were sold. So literally, we're now in the schoolyard, and there's a couple tables set up where where the school supplies are being sold. But the key is there's a first table in which they're getting their deposits out. And here's the key test. We had a control group that didn't get any of this, and one treatment group, the money they got out, and they were told ahead of time, when you get your money out, you will have to spend that money on the school supplies that will be sold right then and there too. Okay, so to the extent that what you're needing here is a commitment device to really help you stay on track and get your money allocated to the school supplies, this money will have to get spent on school supplies. And so you literally what happened was you're given a little piece of paper that said your balance, and then you would walk to the next booth, and then you would do the transaction. That was one treatment group. We'll call that the voucher treatment group. The other treatment group, when they went to that booth, they were just given the cash. Here's your 17 shillings or how much they had saved, and then they could go to the next booth and they could spend the cash, or they could walk away. They didn't have to do anything. It was cash. So one of these worked, and by worked I mean deposits went in, school supplies were purchased, and test scores went up by 8%. Which is actually a big improvement in test scores if you think about it, given that we didn't do anything actually on the education side. Okay, so one worked and one did not. One just stayed the same as the control group. So what I want to see is a show of hands. Raise your hand if you think the strong commitment device, I'll call it strong and weak, the strong commitment device, commitment savings account with the voucher worked. Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you think the weak one worked. Very few. Lots of non-voters still. Okay. Usually I get 50-50 on this. This one was more like 4/5 of you being wrong and 1/5 of you being right. So the weak commitment device was better. People, when we made it too tight, so we have all these ideas that commitment is very helpful for savings, but this result suggests that yes, we do want some commitment, but don't make it too tight. If it's too committed, then what happened is people didn't put the money in. And qualitatively, some of the stories we were told was simply, well, I wanted option value. Like, I was nervous. What if I, just too many unknowns. So, and the cash was like the perfect nudge to get people to do it, because when they got the cash out, it was really easy to go buy the school supplies. So people didn't just skip the line and go somewhere else. It was just made so it was right there, very easy for people to do exactly what they said they want to do. So here's a graph of 10 studies. And what we're trying to look at here in a very hand-waving way is what's an overall pattern of how of take-up and usage of accounts as it correlates with how strong the commitment is. So here on the left are 3 studies that we've done that are the simplest possible thing you can imagine. All we did is give people access to a bank account, nothing more. These bank accounts there was no commitment feature to them whatsoever. They just had a fee that was associated with to open an account and a monthly fee, and we paid that. So they got a zero cost account, but it was fully liquid. They could withdraw the money whenever they want at no fee, and there was no encouragement to use it, no saving, no commitment aspect whatsoever. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have the ones that are the strongest. So the one over here on the very far right was my study on this, which was my first dive into this area. And here the commitment was actually quite strong. It was that you cannot withdraw your money until you reach your goal. Your money was locked into the bank. And if your goal was $100, you couldn't get your money until then. So roughly focusing here on the red bars, we have this kind of upside down U, it seems, where too weak and too strong is not generating as much usage, things in the middle. That's a very hand-waving statement. The strongest result does come from the studies which actually look within the study at multiple arms. And again, that's kind of seeming to be a similar pattern. That a lot of the commitment, it helps to have some commitments in place, but a lot of that can be generated through psychological commitments, or maybe peer commitments is another area to consider. So then looking at attention, this is a particularly exciting area in the sense that it's so easy to do now with mobile money and text messaging. So we have 3 studies that we put together, 3 countries that looked at simple messaging. The first idea here off the cuff is to kind of get rid of a story that we've often heard, which is, why don't the poor save because they don't have money? If that were the case, sending someone a text message saying, hey, reminding you to save should have no effect on anything whatsoever. Right? But it turns out sending people a very simple text message, reminding them to say, boom, we see savings go up. So on average, we have a 6% increase, 3 percentage points more likely to reach a goal. These are kind of small, but at the same time, a text message is even smaller. That's a very, very cheap thing to do, is to send a text message. So this was actually part of this study here is published, but we're now embarking on a much larger set of studies where we're piling together hopefully dozens of similar experiments working with mobile operators or mobile money or financial institutions to test out more about when the messages work and when they don't. Because this result that I have up here was not the same in every place we did it and for every definable group of people. There's a lot of heterogeneity, and so there's a lot to learn about how to send these messages and how to make them effective. One theme, for instance, was one test we did was messages which named the thing they were saving for were more effective. So this goes exactly to the exercise I was describing with the other category. When we said, hey, you had a goal of saving for education, don't forget to make your deposit, that was more effective than just, hey, don't forget to make your deposit. Okay, so what about, this is the last bit, insurance. Right, so again, I'm going back to saying, to thinking through, financial inclusion has many aspirations. The industry kind of started off with credit. It didn't quite achieve the goals we had. What are the other things we need to be considering? So there's been a lot of recent work on microinsurance, including some by Dean Yang, for instance, in Malawi. So this is a study from northern Ghana in which we wanted to run a little bit of a horse race. We want to understand what matters more, cash or risk. So we knew what we would get if we do a focus group. Go back to my example with the South Africa lending. If we did a focus group on this, cash would win. And if we ask farmers, why aren't you investing more in your farm? Why aren't you investing in fertilizer? Why are you leaving land fallow? The universal answer we would get right off the bat would be, because I don't have any money. The second answer we get, so it wasn't as deep down as the pretty women, but it was deeper down than money, was the risk. Well, what if there's bad rainfall? What if there's a drought or a flood? So I don't want to put fertilizer in my land, and I prefer to just leave that money in cash, because in a world in which there's a drought or a flood, I want to at least have that cash remaining. And I realize this doesn't make me the most money I can if the weather's good, but I'm more concerned with when the weather's not good than when it's good. So we ran a test. We gave some farmers just cash to see how much more do they now invest in their farm. We gave other farmers rainfall insurance, so an index insurance that simply paid off if there was a drought or a flood. We gave other farmers both. What if the problem is both? If the problem is both, and both of these constraints are totally binding, if we give people rainfall insurance and they have no money, they're like, well, thanks for the rainfall insurance, but I can't do anything about it. So it's going to help protect me at a bad time, but it's not going to lead to more investment because I need money. Likewise, if we give them money, they might say, well, that's great, but I'm going to go and do something totally different with it, not my farm, because of the risk of the farm. So that would suggest doing both has this additive effect. So what we found that rainfall really was the big driver. If all we did is give people rainfall insurance and nothing more, no cash, they invested more in chemicals, fertilizer, they invested more fallow land, they hired labor. It was a striking result. If we gave them cash, they did increase investments too. So it's not that people were not credit constrained. They still lacked money. But when we reduced the risk, they pulled money from other things and put it into the farm. Right? And that's a striking result, particularly given the price difference. So if we're thinking like subsidies, the insurance was 1/10 of the cost of the grants in terms of what it costs to then generate these types of results. So this is just a striking result that risk matters. And when we want to think about financial inclusion in the agricultural space in particular, we really ought to be thinking heavily about how to handle risk. A lot of what I've said comes from these three papers, which I believe will be up. You said, I believe, Davila, you said that the PowerPoint will be up. So a lot of what I've talked about comes from these three different review papers. So if that interests you, I've put this in the PowerPoint slides so you could see them. And so I want to leave you with those two thoughts that I started off with at some point. The first is evidence trumps hope and intuition. A lot of the results that we've seen, I think a lot of the results we saw earlier today, if those were put up where all the presenters did, in fact, this would be a fun way to run a conference. All you do is present the design of the test, let the audience make their vote. What do they think is going to happen? And then reveal the results. To be honest with you, I think we'd all learn a lot more. Not only would it probably make us, at least it would make me pay more attention in the design phase, because I'd have to take my vote, but you learn a lot more when you go, well, that's not what I expected, than when you just kind of nod along, hear the results, say, yeah, that makes sense, that's intuitive. It kind of sinks in a lot more when it's not what you expect. I did find, by the way, I presented the paper I told you earlier about from Uganda in an audience once where I got exactly half of the room voting one way and exactly the other half voting the other. This was a seminar at the economics department at Berkeley. And unfortunately, it did not stop one of the audience members at the end of the talk from raising his hand and saying, I think your results are obvious. And so even if you kind of do these things up front, it's always easy to backtrack and rationalize. So the point is, we don't always know what's going to work. We cannot rely on our hopes, and we can't rely on simply our intuitions. We need to go get evidence. We need to find out what's actually working, what's not. And the second lesson from all of this is design for humans. That we're all weak people, but we're weak in very different ways. And we need to understand those things, and we need to think about how to design products around that. Let's not try to change the beast, just to kind of accept humans for who they are. And then think about how we should be designing products to help guide people to the thing that they would say they want if they had a moment of deep reflection. What would they say they want to be doing? Would they say they want to be saving? Great. Let's figure out what the gap is, why aren't they saving, and help them do so. So with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
Vamos agora ter algumas perguntas, por favor.
Eu gostei muito do que está a fazer no teste de falar sobre a educação, da liderança.
Tem que ligar o microfone, por favor. Se calhar sou.
Ok, desculpa. De dar uma oportunidade mais uma vez. Eu gostei muito de ouvir que está a tentar ou experimentar esta ideia da possibilidade de faltar duas prestações. E de facto, esta não é a primeira vez que esta ideia surgiu. Mas falando como diretora de operações, eu não faço ideia como configurar um sistema para fazer isso. Então, se depois de experiência pode explicar como se faz, eu estaria muito interessado. Do you want me to repeat it in English? Okay. What I said was that the idea of allowing clients to 2 free passes on their loan installments is... Okay, so what I said was the idea of building in flexibility into the loan schedule so that a client can miss 2 loan payments is not the first time that I've heard the idea. The only problem is I have no idea how to configure the system to allow you to do that. So if your experience shows you or how that can be done, I'd be very interested to know.
Let's collect some more if there is more question. Mais perguntas, por favor.
Dean, thank you for a great presentation. I think the thing about the woman is quite clear. There's been some sort of research on as agents as well, and it's clear that men prefer to deal with women agents, and the women don't mind either way. The one thing I was trying to ask you about the financial inclusion definition and why you excluded payments, was that on purpose or just for the purpose of your presentation? Micropayments, and following from that question, have you done other research around over-the-counter micropayments versus wallet-based, and what do you think about over-the-counter micropayments, if it falls under the definition of financial inclusion or not?
Mais alguma pergunta?
Por favor.
Boa tarde, obrigada. Eu queria, antes de mais, agradecer a intervenção do professor Dean Karlan e de todos os participantes palestrantes anteriores nesta sessão, e gostaria apenas de colocar a seguinte questão. Para mim foi uma grande novidade, de facto, apresentar aqui a ideia de que o microcrédito não tem atingido o objetivo final do alívio da pobreza. E compreendo perfeitamente todas estas variantes que apresentou aqui da questão de ser necessário adaptar um modelo dos empréstimos às necessidades das pessoas, o fator risco, a questão da confiança, etc. Mas perguntava-se porventura, com estes resultados, já as instituições do microcrédito já estão neste momento a olhar para a nova forma de responder às necessidades das pessoas, ou se do conhecimento que o professor Dean Karlan tem, mantém os mesmos modelos, os mesmos mecanismos. Isto porque daqui para a semana as Nações Unidas vão realizar a terceira conferência sobre Financing for Development e o microcrédito sempre surgiu como uma das bandeiras do alívio da dívida e um dos modelos a seguir, e foi sempre muito promovido junto das instituições financeiras e junto dos governos e da sociedade civil como uma bandeira, e portanto gostaria de ter a sua perspectiva quanto ao futuro do microcrédito. Obrigada.
Bom, nós temos 3 perguntas, acho que...
Thank you for each of these. Let me answer the first by actually punting a little bit, in the sense that I think let me just restate so you know which one. The question about the systems issues for implementing flexible lending. The punt is simply that I can't answer that without digging into the details of your systems. And I'm sympathetic to it. I actually, when I mentioned the time in El Salvador, I wasn't a researcher. I was actually building a software system for Finca International. It was a total failure, biggest failure of my life. But got me where I am now, so I'm happy about that. But so, you know, the devil isn't. I totally agree there are issues there. In fact, we are having. We're having a human resource system issue in the Columbia study that I mentioned, which is that the incentive system for the credit officers is not aligned with profitability. It's aligned. It's the way it's set up. Basically, is they are really nervous about letting clients actually use these free passes. So we're fixing this, and we're kind of in pilot phase, and we're seeing the issues. But that's a human resource system that needs to be aligned with really getting the employees on board with, no, these passes are actually a good thing, and you should encourage their use when appropriate and not see it as a bad thing. But you know, the details of how to do that are surmountable. We've dealt with many credit product changes in other studies where we did have to get involved in the systems. That doesn't mean that I'd have to know your systems to know what would be involved. Second question about payments. So I did make this kind of, alluded to this kind of, should it be here or not question. So here's the reason why I don't, but it's nebulous. I don't know the right answer. The reason I don't kind of stems from how I defined finance, which is about facilitating matching up savings and consumption. So when you think about it that way, income and consumption. When you think about it that way, that all forms of borrowing, saving, or insurance are about dealing with that mismatch. What payments is simply about a transaction cost. So make the following, let me give you a different alternative. Suppose for a moment that there was something, some stores were simply able to offer their services for cheaper than some other stores. They were going to sell cookies and milk for less money. We wouldn't call that financial inclusion because we got people cheaper cookies and milk. In a sense, a cheaper way of sending payments is just a lowering of transaction costs, and it's a cheaper way of getting them the service. It used to be that if they want to go and pay their electricity bill, they had to spend an hour online somewhere. Now they don't. So we've just lowered the price of electricity. And that's the sense in which I don't think of it as a financial, I don't put it under the financial inclusion umbrella. It's an important financial cost, right? So to the extent that we want to just figure out how we can lower costs for consumers in general so they can buy more things with the same income, then it's a great thing, and we do want to figure out how to promote it. It just doesn't go under the umbrella of financial inclusion. It'd be the same thing as saying, we can improve the distribution network of getting products through local stores that can help people buy less. This is otherwise known as Walmart in America and other parts of the world, right? This is doing great things for helping consumers buy more things, lowering their transaction cost to buy stuff, but we don't call Walmart financial inclusion. It doesn't mean we don't like it. So that's kind of weird, but I totally agree that it is a little bit of a gray area, and we've definitely gotten into the space.
So yeah, I think the issue that could be a very gray area is remittances, potentially. because some people might call it a payment, but in effect it's potentially somebody moving money from one place to another to do those things you're talking about in terms of matching income with expenses.
So, and to break down so suppose remittances go up. To the extent that it goes up simply because of price, then I might make the same argument I made. But if it actually created an insurance vehicle that wasn't there before, well then that's financial inclusion. So I totally agree. Microcredit, where do I see it going? Looking for new ways. So I have two broad thoughts. One is we have seen a lot of we have seen a few areas expanding. So we have seen many lenders, for instance, Kiva. Is Kiva present in Mozambique? No, it's a funder of microcredit, not a direct lender. So there are a lot of groups that have seen the kind of less than satisfying results from the donor's perspective. They're very satisfying from an investor's perspective, but from a donor's perspective they have started exploring other models. I don't know, I couldn't tell you what proportion it is, so I don't know whether this, there's a huge selection bias of what I see, right? I see the ones that come to us and are all jazzed about trying to do something new. Someone's going to ignore all this research that I've done and others have done. They don't come to me and tell me that. So I don't want to overstate how much of the world is shifting, but we do see a lot of group shifting. There's one really important area that we've seen a big shift though, and this we have seen, and this I can actually speak to numbers. And that has to do with the targeting the ultra poor. So one recognition is that the microcredit programs were not increasing income and were not reaching the poor. And they weren't even reaching them in the first place. But when they would reach them, it wasn't leading to higher income, as I showed you. So there is a set of programs that have been tested out. We just ran 6 randomized trials, in fact, of the same basic program in 6 countries: Peru, Honduras, India, Pakistan, Ethiopia, and Ghana. These results were just released about 2 months ago, published in Science. And we found really striking results. This was a grant program, this is not a lending program, okay? And it's now being looked at and adopted by government social protection programs, basically. It's basically where it fits in terms of its scale. And we're seeing it now taken to about 3 million households in Ethiopia, India, and Pakistan. And that's, we're really just at the beginning of the kind of the scaling process. But this is a very holistic program, and it actually did, for what it's worth, this program came out of frustration with microcredit. So it is a direct, they can be motivated completely irrelevant to microcredit, to be honest. They can be motivated strictly as social protection. But it actually was started by Brock in Bangladesh, recognizing we're not doing what we said we were doing. What should we do? And they tried this out, and it worked there. And then we replicated it in 6 other places, and we found these really positive results. And so that is actually now being taken scale. But like I said, this is a holistic grant-based program. You give people a grant, typically some livestock, like 4 goats, some consumption support so they don't immediately slaughter the goat. You give them access to a savings account, a little bit of healthcare, a lot of training and household visits to help coach them and build aspirations and discipline, but also information about how to earn the livelihood. All of this is done together. I think there has actually been a conversation here in Mozambique as well. I'm not up on all the status of every connection, but I do believe that the one of the ministries from Mozambique was in Paris last year for our gathering in which they were discussing adopting this program here too. I don't know the status on that though.
Bom, dado adiantado da hora, acho que vamos fechar aqui. De qualquer forma, o professor de Karlan vai ficar mais um pouco para o café, se alguém tiver mais alguma pergunta, mas já estamos bem para além da hora. Por isso, thank you very much for your presentation.